Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you a powerful tale of success, struggle, and profound transformation. Meet Jake Thompson, a CEO who built his empire on the belief that hard work always pays off. But when he witnesses the quiet hardships of one of his employees, Emily, he begins to question everything he thought he knew about work, survival, and the true cost of success. This is a story of discovery, empathy, and a decision that changes not just a company, but lives. Subscribe to our channel and start today's journey with Life Stories. Jake Thompson had always believed in the undeniable power of hard work. It was the cornerstone of everything he had built in life. As the CEO of Thompson Logistics, a company he founded with nothing but determination and a simple dream, Jake had weathered storms, both personal and professional, and emerged victorious. He often reminded himself that success was a reward earned through sleepless nights, unwavering discipline, and relentless effort. Growing up without any family wealth or connections, he knew firsthand that nothing in life was handed to you. You had to earn it. Thompson Logistics, headquartered in the bustling heart of Dallas, Texas, had grown from a modest one-man trucking operation into a vast network with fleets stretching across the entire country. The business had flourished, but Jake's philosophy had remained the same: hard work would always pay off. He made sure his employees were well compensated for their effort. It wasn't just about the money, though. He instilled in them a sense of purpose. You worked for Thompson Logistics. You worked to win, and that was the only rule he set. No excuses. Jake's employees respected him. They feared him, too. In a way, he was known as the man who never missed a deadline, who pushed his team harder than anyone else would, but also paid them well in return. He saw himself as a fair man. If you gave him your best, you would be rewarded. Simple as that. For years, this belief had guided him through the highs and lows of running a company. No one ever questioned his methods, and he never doubted his approach. But there was one thing Jake never did, something that many CEOs might overlook: he never pried into his employees' personal lives. He believed that work was just work, and life was something separate. His employees knew what was expected of them when they clocked in, and as long as they delivered, what happened after hours was none of his concern. But that belief, that mantra of working hard and getting what you deserved, was about to be tested in ways Jake couldn't have anticipated. It all started one ordinary evening. Jake was sitting in his glass-walled office, sipping on a cup of coffee and reviewing the company's quarterly performance metrics. The office was mostly empty now. Most of the staff had clocked out, the usual buzz of conversation and movement replaced by the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Only the cleaning crew remained, making their rounds in the corridors. It was late, but Jake wasn't about to leave just yet. He had a few more numbers to review before he called it a night. But as he glanced out of his office window, something caught his eye: a figure lingering near the break room, just beyond the dimly lit hallway. He squinted to see better. It was Emily Carter, one of his employees. She wasn't someone Jake knew personally, but he recognized her. Emily was the type of worker who never complained, never asked for special treatment. She was always there when overtime was available, covering shifts when others couldn't. She was reliable, the kind of employee any CEO would want. And yet, tonight, something about her movements made Jake pause. Emily stood near the food counter in the break room, her body language hesitant, almost nervous. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, as though unsure whether she should even be there. The cafeteria had closed hours ago. Yet there she was, speaking quietly with the cook, a man Jake barely knew but recognized from the few times he had grabbed a late-night coffee. Their exchange was brief, and too quiet for Jake to hear the words. But he could tell from the cook's hesitance, from the way he glanced around before reaching under the counter for something, that this wasn't a casual interaction. Emily's shoulders relaxed, almost as though in relief, as she tucked the takeout container into her oversized tote bag. She glanced around quickly, checking to see if anyone was watching, before she made her way to the exit. Her pace was quick, but there was an urgency to it, as though she didn't want anyone to know what had just happened. Jake sat there for a moment, his mind racing. He was used to seeing employees stay late, especially those who took on extra work. But he had never seen anything like this. He wasn't the type of boss who pried into his employees' lives. But the image of Emily taking that food home gnawed at him. She worked harder than most of them. She worked double shifts sometimes. Even triple shifts when necessary. If anyone should be able to afford a meal, it was her. So why had she needed to ask for food? Jake's thoughts swirled in his mind. Questions forming one after another. Maybe it was nothing, he told himself. Maybe she'd just forgotten her wallet or was saving money for something more important. Maybe it wasn't his problem. But somehow, the more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. He couldn't shake the image of Emily hurriedly stuffing the takeout container into her bag like it was something she wasn't supposed to have. What if there was more to it? Jake wasn't the kind of man who made impulsive decisions based on fleeting emotions. But something about the situation was bothering him. Something that was deeper than simple curiosity. As he stared at his screen, the numbers in front of him began to blur. They no longer seemed important. His mind kept returning to that image, the takeout container, the hurried steps, the worried glance. He stood up from his desk. His fingers tented in front of him. Deep in thought, without realizing it, his feet were already moving. He wasn't sure what drove him to do it. But before his mind could catch up, he found himself outside, stepping into the cool night air. He glanced around the parking lot, his eyes scanning the street. There she was, walking towards the bus stop. No car, no waiting ride, just her and the weight of her tote bag on her shoulder. For a moment, Jake hesitated. This wasn't his business. But when the next bus arrived and Emily stepped on, something inside him pushed him to follow. The bus rattled along, its dim lights flickering occasionally as it moved through the quiet streets of Dallas. Jake found a seat towards the back, far enough to keep a low profile, but close enough to observe Emily without drawing attention to himself. The bus was almost empty, the few remaining passengers lost in their own worlds. Emily, however, was not like the others. She sat near the middle, her posture slouched and her head resting against the cold window. It was the kind of exhaustion that wasn't simply from a long day at work. This was something deeper, something that came from carrying a heavy weight for far too long. Jake watched her, his thoughts still tangled in the image of her at the office. What had made her so careful, so secretive about taking the food? He'd never seen Emily act like this before. She had always been the model employee, quiet, hard-working, never one to ask for help. But tonight, there was something in the way she moved, in the way she seemed almost invisible to the world around her. It was as if she had mastered the art of blending in, of not drawing attention. And Jake couldn't help but wonder how long this had been going on. The city outside the bus window passed in a blur. Neon signs from late-night gas stations flashed by, and the warm glow of diners cast pools of light on the sidewalk. The streets were still busy. But as the bus moved further from the city center, the landscape began to change. The buildings grew smaller, older, the streetlights were sparse, flickering on and off, casting brief shadows over the cracked sidewalks. Jake realized then that he had never been this far from the city's bustling heart. This part of Dallas felt foreign to him, a place he'd never seen in all his years of running a business here. Emily barely moved the entire time. She didn't check her phone, didn't fidget with her bag. She just stared out of the window, her face expressionless, as if accepting whatever came her way without resistance. There was a quiet resignation to her, a weariness that Jake could feel even from where he sat. How many nights had she taken this same route? How many times had she come home to this part of the city? After long hours of work, only to face something more than exhaustion? The bus slowed, and Emily reached up to pull the stop cord without hesitation. Jake watched as she stood, adjusted the strap of her bag, and pulled her thin jacket tighter around her body. She stepped off the bus and onto the sidewalk, her footsteps echoing in the quiet night. Jake followed at a distance, careful not to be noticed. The air was cool now, the damp scent of rain on the pavement hanging in the air. The streetlights were few and far between, casting a faint glow on the rundown buildings around them. The houses here weren't abandoned, but they were far from well kept. Paint was peeling off the walls, and the mailboxes leaned at strange angles. It was the kind of place where people didn't expect much from life. A place where survival seemed more important than comfort. Emily moved with purpose. Even in her exhaustion, she turned a corner, past rows of rusted railings and dimly lit porches, until she reached a small apartment complex. It was a far cry from the sleek office buildings Jake was used to. The complex had clearly seen better days, its walls weathered and worn. But still, Emily climbed the stairs to the second floor without a second thought. Pulled out a set of keys, and unlocked the door to her apartment. Jake stopped just short of the building, unable to move any closer. He stood there for a moment, his heart heavy in his chest as he watched Emily step inside. Through the thin, yellowed curtains of her apartment, he could see the barest outlines of the space within. It was empty, in the way that suggested someone had been living without much for a long time. There were no couches, no dining table, just a single mattress on the floor, a few blankets, and a plastic crate stacked with neatly folded clothes. And then, as his eyes adjusted, Jake saw them, two small heads peeking out from the side of the mattress. Children. A sharp pang of realization struck Jake in the gut. He had spent years building his business, pushing his employees to work harder, to push past their limits. But had he ever really stopped to think about what they were going home to? Had he ever considered what kind of lives they were leading after clocking out? Emily's movements were slow and careful as she knelt beside the children. Her exhaustion momentarily forgotten, she set the takeout container down in front of them with an almost reverent touch. The children, no older than 5 or 6, scrambled forward, their eyes wide and their movements frantic. They weren't reaching for the food casually, they were grabbing it with an urgency that spoke of long waits, of hunger that couldn't be ignored. Emily divided the meal between them, making sure each child received an equal share. But there was something in her eyes that told Jake everything he needed to know. She wasn't going to eat. She just watched, her face drawn and tired, as her children devoured the food with the kind of hunger that only comes when you've been waiting for far too long. Jake's chest tightened as he stood there, a strange mixture of guilt and helplessness flooding through him. He had always believed in hard work. He had always believed that if you put in the effort, you would succeed. But now, standing in the shadows of that apartment complex, watching Emily take care of her children in the way she did, he couldn't help but wonder if hard work was really enough. Was it truly enough to just work harder, push further, if the system itself was broken? The weight of it all settled on him like a stone in his stomach. This wasn't just about an individual's struggle, it was about something much larger. Something he had failed to see. For the first time in his life, Jake wasn't sure what the right answer was. Was hard work truly enough to make it? Or had he been looking at success all wrong? He needed to leave. He had seen too much. But as he turned to go, a small voice broke through the stillness of the night. "Mommy, are we going to have breakfast tomorrow?" Jake froze. Emily hesitated for just a second, her face softening as she smoothed her daughter's curls back from her face. "Of course, baby," she whispered. "I'll figure it out." But Jake could see the truth in her eyes. It wasn't a promise she could keep, not really. It was just a shield. A fragile thing meant to comfort her children, not herself. In that moment, everything inside Jake shifted. This wasn't just about working harder. This was about survival. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if hard work alone could ever be enough. The next morning, Jake sat at his desk, the cold light of dawn filtering through the windows of his office. He was staring at his laptop screen, but the numbers and graphs in front of him were nothing more than a blur. His mind was still with Emily, still with the image of her kneeling beside her children, watching them devour the takeout as if it were the first meal they had seen in days. He tried to focus on the quarterly reports, to think about the logistics of running his company, but everything felt irrelevant now. The calculations seemed hollow, the numbers insignificant. He had spent years building Thompson Logistics from the ground up, priding himself on his work ethic and his belief that hard work would always be rewarded. He had built an empire based on that belief, creating a system that rewarded discipline and dedication. But now, sitting in the quiet of his office, everything he thought he knew about success felt shattered. The image of Emily and her children gnawed at him. making him question whether hard work was truly enough. Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He had always believed that people like Emily, people who worked harder than anyone else, were the ones who should succeed. But what if the system itself was broken? What if hard work wasn't the answer? He had built his business on the premise that if you worked hard enough, you could achieve anything. But Emily had worked tirelessly. And still, she was struggling to survive. As he sat there, lost in thought, his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice breaking through his haze. "Emily Carter is here to see you." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this. Or perhaps hoping for it. He had spent the past hour wondering whether he should reach out to Emily. Whether he should address what he had seen the night before. But here she was, coming to him of her own volition. Something in his gut told him that this conversation was going to change everything. He straightened in his chair, smoothing his expression into something neutral. "Send her in," he replied. A moment later, Emily walked into his office. She looked just as tired as she had the night before, her face drawn and weary, as though she hadn't had a moment's rest since their encounter. Her posture was rigid, controlled. She sat down across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. There was no sign of emotion in her eyes, only a quiet determination. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Her voice was steady, almost professional, but Jake could hear the faintest edge of anxiety in it. She wasn't here for sympathy. He realized, she wasn't here to make excuses. She was here because something had changed. And now she was ready to confront it. Jake studied her for a moment, his mind racing. He had rehearsed a dozen different ways to approach this conversation. But now that the moment had arrived, none of them felt right. There was no easy way to say what he had to say. So, he simply spoke the truth. "I saw you last night, Emily," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I followed you home." Emily's face stiffened, just slightly, but Jake saw the flicker of confusion and then anger flash in her eyes. Her fingers curled into fists. But she didn't move, she didn't lash out. "I don't understand," she said, her voice tight, controlled, as though she were trying to hide her panic. "I saw you take the food," Jake continued, his voice steady. "I saw your apartment. I saw your children." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and charged. Emily's breath hitched, and Jake saw the walls go up, the same walls she had likely built to protect herself from the world. But he could see beyond them now. He could see the fear, the exhaustion, the fight that lived behind those walls. Emily shook her head, her shoulders squared, ready to defend herself. "This isn't," she began. But Jake interrupted her gently. "I'm not here to judge you, Emily," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm not here to pity you either. I'm here because I should have seen it sooner. And I want to fix it." There was a long silence as Emily searched his face, as if trying to gauge whether he was telling the truth, whether he meant what he was saying. She had probably heard words like this before, from people who had promised to help but never followed through. She had probably been told to work harder, to push herself more, but no one had ever stopped to ask why. No one had ever taken the time to truly understand. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice faltering. Jake shook his head, his resolve hardening. "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "I have the power to change this. And I will." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick envelope, sliding it across the desk toward her. "This isn't charity," he said before she could protest. "This is an investment, in you. In the people who make this company run." Emily glanced at the envelope. But she didn't reach for it. She hesitated, unsure of what to do, unsure of whether she deserved it. Jake leaned forward slightly, his voice urgent. "I want to raise wages," he said. "Provide better hours, child care support, emergency assistance. I need your help to do it the right way. To make sure no one else has to go home the way you did last night." Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. She was still trying to process what he was saying. Jake watched her carefully, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was asking her to trust him. Trust him in a way she had never been asked to trust anyone before. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached forward. Her fingers hovered over the envelope before she grasped it tightly. as if she were holding onto something fragile. Tears welled in her eyes. But she blinked them back, unwilling to show too much emotion. She wasn't used to accepting help. She wasn't used to anyone offering it. Jake met her gaze, his own unwavering. "You don't have to do this alone anymore, Emily." And in that moment, something shifted. Emily nodded, her shoulders squared as she stood, the envelope pressed against her chest. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. Jake watched her walk out of his office, the weight in his chest lifting ever so slightly. This wasn't just about changing his company anymore. This was about changing lives, and he was just getting started. As Emily walked out of his office, the weight that had been pressing down on Jake for the past few days seemed to lift. It wasn't gone entirely. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but there was a sense of purpose now. A clarity that had been missing before. He had spent years believing that success was solely about hard work. About the numbers. About the bottom line. But now, standing in the wake of his decision, he understood something deeper. Success wasn't just about pushing people to their limits. It was about lifting them up when they were struggling. It was about recognizing the humanity in the people who helped build your business and understanding that their stories mattered just as much as your own. Emily had taught him that. Her quiet resilience, her ability to keep going despite everything, had made him realize that the system he had built was broken. And it was time to rebuild it, for everyone. Not just for those at the top. Jake leaned back in his chair, feeling the cool breeze from the window. It was a new day. And with it came a new purpose. He had taken the first step toward changing lives. And he knew it wouldn't be easy. But he was ready. Ready to fight for something bigger than just profits. Ready to fight for people. This was just the beginning. And as he sat there, the door to his office still lingering open, Jake knew that what he had done was the right thing. It wasn't just about making money anymore. It was about making a difference. To follow more stories like Emily's and discover the profound lessons life has to offer, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories that will challenge your perspective and touch your heart.